Metroid is dead. You'd be surprised just how common a phrase this was back in the mid-2010s. Heck, that term, dead, was practically inseparable from the series at this point. And this is despite the previous decade housing more Metroid games than the series had ever had. I'm serious, the 2000s were pretty much stuffed with Metroid releases. You could barely go a year without some kind of Metroid. With the advent of Metroid Prime, the series would see a slew of games, all constantly regarded as some of the best Nintendo's ever put out. All was going well, but unbeknownst to everyone, there was a storm brewing not far in the distance. In 2010, Nintendo was set to release the next major title in the series, one that was supposed to break into new territory and be a game on a scale the likes the Metroid series has never seen. This game, Metroid Other M, seemed from the outside like this massive, high-budget spectacle of a game, one with production values beyond what even Prime 3 could manage. Surely this title would take the series to soaring new heights, but that never happened. Instead, upon Other M's release, the game would turn out to be an absolute mess for fans of the series. Sure, the game looked great and had high production values, but that meant nothing against the litany of other issues. The game was streamlined and simplified to the point of not feeling anything like Metroid at all. Exploration was virtually non-existent. Instead, the focus was on combat, which in the end, even that ended up feeling more flashy than complex. But these issues paled in comparison to what they did to Samus herself, portraying the bounty hunter as nothing but a scared little girl unwilling to go against orders, even if it might cost her her life. Needless to say, Other M wasn't received all that well by the fans. And yeah, that sucked, but they could always get it right with the next one, right? Surely the next Metroid game wouldn't be too far off, right? And this is where everything started to fall apart. Years would pass without so much as a mention of the series from Nintendo. When 2014 came around, Retro Studios announced its next project wasn't actually a return to the Metroid Prime series like everyone was hoping for. Instead, they decided to continue the Donkey Kong Country series with Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. While this game would end up being one of the best games released on the Wii U, that didn't stop Metroid fans from feeling even more bitter. I mean, after 4 years of waiting for something, anything, everyone's last hope for a Metroid revival decided to do something completely different. And unfortunately for Donkey Kong, his next game would be ensnared in this bitter hatred from fans of Metroid, causing a wonderful 2D platformer to fall by the wayside as Metroid fans refused to even give it a chance. Regardless of that, the wait would continue for even longer. By this point, Metroid Other M had been the last Metroid game for 5 years. The series had essentially ended on what was the video game equivalent of sparkling water, something that looks and sounds cool, but isn't exactly an ideal experience for most. At this point, fans were just hoping for something to wash the bitter taste out of their mouths. And then, at E3 2015, Nintendo would finally give what starving Metroid fans were No, not at all. Instead, what we got was Metroid Prime Federation Force, a cooperative multiplayer shooter with a chibi art style and a tone and atmosphere decidedly nothing like Metroid at all. This went over very poorly. It felt like Nintendo was actively spitting in the face of all the fans, and this is coming from someone that wasn't a fan of the Metroid series at the time. Now, to be fair, this really wasn't a great time to be a Nintendo fan in general. Plenty of other franchises would see this destructive, almost nonsensical approach, but Metroid fans definitely had it bad. Now, to be fair to Federation Force, it wasn't even a bad game. The problem is that it came out at the exact wrong time, and fans let them know that. Coverage of the game was besieged by constant negativity. Metroid fans took any chance they could to make their feelings clear. The negativity clearly got noticed by Nintendo as well. When they finally brought the game up again after almost a year of not even mentioning it, Bill Trinen came on with this serious face, and the tone of this part of the Direct was notably more serious than you'd expect. The game was practically dead on impact, and it was just another case of Nintendo clearly expressing that they had no clue what the Metroid fans wanted. Not helping things was at the same time they were releasing Federation Force, they decided to attack a little fan project by the name of AM2R, a fan-made remake of Metroid 2 that took years and years to make. Yet again, Metroid fans were left in the dust, forced to settle for a low-budget multiplayer shooter, like that was supposed to be enough for everyone. And so, Metroid became dead. 7 years without a major game was already bad enough, but this wasn't the first time the series would see this kind of hiatus. What made this worse was Nintendo's constant spitting in the face of Metroid fans. a game that belittled the character of Samus and corrupted the series, a game no one asked for coming out at the worst possible time, a game cancellation, the removal of AM2R. For a time, it felt like Nintendo was going out of its way to make fans unhappy. It's no wonder why everyone said the series was dead. It might as well have been. And after Federation Force flopped horrendously, it really looks like that might be it. I mean, what if Federation Force really was Nintendo's last real shot at making the series viable again? The series had never really been a massive seller, and after Other M's failure and a notable lack of sales growth across entries, Federation Force might have been it. One last shot in the dark that completely blew up in Nintendo's face. So by 2017, there was pretty much no hope for the franchise. Fans of Metroid had basically resigned themselves to giving up as a whole, forced to relive the successes of days gone by to have any hope of keeping the magic alive. And after all this, I can't even imagine just how good this felt. In a mere couple hours, Metroid had somehow went from a dead franchise to having 2 new games, one being the next mainline entry in the beloved Metroid Prime series, and the other being a full-fledged remake of Metroid 2 Return of Samus, the latter of which was exciting because it was the first 2D Metroid game in 13 years. Needless to say, fans were absolutely ecstatic about this. Finally, after all these years, it felt like Nintendo had listened. It finally felt like Nintendo understood what Metroid fans had been asking for all these years. Sure, it didn't make up for the last 7 years, but it was a step in the right direction. It showed that Nintendo was genuinely going to do right by its fans, and this is where I came in. Remember, at this point, I had never really gotten into a Metroid title. Trust me, I tried, but, well, let's just say that telling me I should quote-unquote start with the original Metroid on NES because that's totally a good starting place was not the best advice. I tried getting into it with other games, but I could just never get to grips with its design, and honestly the series was just so daunting that it scared me off of really trying to get invested. But for some reason, Samus Returns was different. While everyone else was going bonkers over finally having a new game, I was instead mesmerized by just how cool the game looked. Something about Samus's new animations and the general world design just made the game seem so cool to me. Later on, they even showed off an ability called the Scan Pulse, which revealed the chunk of the map around Samus, greatly helping someone who might have gotten a bit lost and needed a bit of guidance. Considering the idea of getting stuck was the exact reason why the series seemed so daunting to me, this seemed like everything I could have asked for. And so on September 15th, 2017, I went out and picked up Samus Returns, hoping that finally, this would be the one, that this would be the game that would get me into Metroid. And those hopes weren't unfounded, because Samus Returns would prove to be exactly what I was hoping for. Suddenly, everything just clicked. A series I had struggled to get into for so long finally made sense to me. It was the reason why I was even able to play the other games we've talked about up to this point. Back in 2017, I absolutely adored it. It was unlike anything else I had ever played, with a captivating atmosphere and a wonderfully, fully realized world to explore. And so, as I replayed Samus Returns for this marathon, I was very curious to see how I'd feel about it now. I mean, I've played all the other 2D games in this series. Would Samus Returns feel just as good as when I first played it, or would some of the magic disappear now that I'm a bit more experienced with the series? That was exactly what I intended to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my Game Over analysis of Metroid Samus Returns. Let's finish this. Being that this is a remake of Metroid 2, the plot is obviously pretty much the same. After Samus managed to defeat the space pirates and foil their plot to use the Metroids for their own personal gain, the Galactic Federation deems the Metroids too dangerous to be allowed to exist. They send out a small squadron of soldiers to go check the place out, but they never return. So, figuring she did a good job the first time, they decided why not hire Samus to go take down the Metroids too. And so, Samus heads down to SR-388, the homeworld of the Metroids, to go destroy every last living Metroid. It's a very simple plot in the end, but I like the new intro cutscene. Not only does it have these gorgeous illustrations, but the fact that it even has an intro to begin with makes it ahead of the original Metroid 2 in that regard at least. Man, the scene before landing on the planet is built up really well. After years and years of worry, I imagine this scene must have meant a lot to Metroid fans. Starting out, the first thing you're likely to notice is the controls. Just like in Zero Mission and Fusion, Samus retains that tight, snappy feel. Movement, jumping, firing, it all feels just as good as the previous games. It's surprising that even despite the 3DS's rather iffy control pad, the game feels absolutely smooth the entire way through. Now, some may dislike the inability to use the D-pad to control Samus, but I promise there's a very good reason for it. Because now, Samus is allowed more control than ever before. While holding down the L button, the player is able to fire in 360 degrees of motion. No more awkwardly trying to angle yourself to hit just the right spot. No, instead, now you have the ability to pull off things you could never hope to do in older titles. You can aim backwards while in mid-jump moving forward. You can easily hit specific weak points on an enemy. It's really surprising just how much of a change this feels like. Obviously, puzzle solving is improved by this, as there's a lot less of that awkward angle garbage from the past games, but I honestly feel like it's in the boss fights and enemy fights where this change is most prominent. I now feel like I'm more in control of my actions, and I'm able to pull off some impressive stuff on occasion, all because of this one small change. Another obvious change to the combat makes itself known right away as well. Samus is now able to counter enemy attacks by hitting the X button. Even without correct timing, it can prove very beneficial for getting enemies away from you, but it's primarily used as a means of getting rid of enemies. Most enemies will charge at the player, so a well-timed counter not only knocks the enemy back, but essentially activates a one-hit kill move. People are rather divided on this mechanic though. Some feel like it's too overused and that it ruins the flow of the game. I don't really agree with that statement. Firstly, while there are certainly a couple of enemies that basically can only be countered, others can easily be gotten rid of without it. During this playthrough specifically, even at the beginning, I was using the counter only about half the time, and as the game continued onward, I found myself actually using it less and less. You'd be surprised just how effective a charge shot or a couple quick blasts can subdue an enemy. Also, on the flow end, I honestly think the counter is super satisfying to use. It just has this wonderful slingshot effect, where you have this quick windup and then boom, you slam them. It doesn't ruin the flow as much as change the flow, and honestly, even though I will concede that it might get used a little too often, I still love it as an addition to combat. It just makes everything feel all the more exciting. Running around and dodging attacks, then winding up at just the right moment only to let them have it right after, feels amazing. What I also like about the counter mechanic is that it drastically increases the complexity of enemy designs. I complained in Zero Mission's video that I didn't like how basic the enemies were. They would often just kind of roam around a platform completely independent of Samus's movement. I was always a bigger fan of Fusion's approach to enemy design, where it made enemies an actual threat, and Samus Returns follows that design. Enemies are ruthless in this game, chasing Samus down without a moment's hesitation. You really have to be wary of enemies' movements this time, as not only do several of them move in much more erratic patterns, but also all of them can be absolutely devastating. One hit from a charge attack and Samus will be reeling. Yep, it's a return to the Fusion way of enemy design, where the enemies are not only out for blood, but they're packing some serious damage as well. They're genuinely a blast to deal with and help spice up the general exploration. The only problem is that there's really a lack of enemy variety. There really aren't that many different types of enemies, meaning that you'll be dealing with a lot of the same enemies throughout the entire game. It's certainly not the worst thing in the world, but it would be nice if there was a bit more variety to the types of enemies you deal with. And you know, speaking of enemies, there's none more important to Samus Returns than the Metroids themselves. Like in past games, they were usually an important plot point or a notable enemy, but here they literally dictate the entire structure of the game. Every time you enter a new area, a giant statue will dictate the amount of Metroids in the current area, and your goal is to eradicate every last one of them. From here, the game takes on the same linear, non-linear approach to level design. Linear in that you can't move on to the next area until you get rid of all the Metroids in the current one, but non-linear in the sense that how you go about getting the Metroids and where you decide to go is completely up to you. Not everyone likes this general structure, but I find that it really doesn't feel all too different from the typical Metroid experience. Previous games also gated you off from later areas, but they did so through the use of blockades requiring an upgrade the player hasn't found yet. While Samus Returns' giant statues certainly don't feel quite as natural, they certainly serve the same purpose, a means of blocking off progression until a goal is accomplished. However, despite the means of gating off feeling very different, the actual areas never feel like they lack the same genius structure the previous games had. Areas are still incredibly non-linear, allowing for the same sort of joy of discovery previous games had. The general gameplay loop of finding rooms you can't progress through, only to later discover an upgrade that fixes that very same problem, is still very much intact, but this time those upgrades feel even more useful. In past games, upgrades like the grapple beam would lose all use once a better method of progression, like the space jump for example, completely negated its use. In Samus Returns, however, every ability has multiple uses, meaning that upgrades stay consistently useful throughout the entire game. The developers at Mercury Steam certainly seem to understand how to get the most out of Samus's abilities, and it means that your upgrades never lose value. And regardless of all of that, the level design still retains the same level of quality as the previous games as well. Exploration still feels smooth and exciting, and puzzle design is just as brilliant. The only major issue with the level design comes in with the very spacey rooms. Because Samus Returns feels it needs to replicate the original's design at least vaguely, that means they kept the larger rooms as well. These areas often feel empty, with nothing but empty space for you to fly past so you can get back to the good stuff. Besides these notable exceptions, however, the rest of the level design is brilliant. Eventually, as you explore, however, you'll come across those oh-so-important Metroids, and this is where both the strengths and faults of Samus Returns begin to show themselves the deepest. The Metroids come in 4 different types, each with their own horrifying appearance and unique boss fight. Now, on the positive end of the spectrum, these fights are an absolute blast. They feature attack patterns that are much more complex than past games had for bosses. They're not just damage sponges like in the original, no, they all have multiple attacks. Some that affect the environment itself, some that are projectile based, and heck, some where they just run right after you. They can even block Samus's attacks sometimes as well. The last 2 forms especially are an absolute blast to fight, combining improved spectacle with much more dangerous and dynamic attack patterns to make for some really thrilling fights. Even cooler is that as you continue to fight the Metroids, there's this interesting growth on both the player's end and the Metroid's end as well. On the player's end, while you most likely have a lot of trouble the first time you encounter a form, you gradually learn better and better ways to deal with them. The progression feels super satisfying, going from a bumbling mess to straight up destroying them as the game goes on. Also on the enemy's end, as you continue to fight them, they'll begin pulling out new moves and abilities they didn't have in past battles. Not only do you feel like your own skills as a player evolve as you continue to fight them, but the Metroids as well evolve in turn, making for a much more dynamic battle system than the original game. But on the negative end, sticking so closely to Metroid 2 also means that after a while, these fights kind of become repetitive. Like, sure, the enemies evolve and all, but that doesn't change the fact that you're essentially fighting the same enemy up to 10 times. And just like with the enemies, there's not much variety in the types either. 4 types of Metroids for around 40 Metroids you have to fight in the game is about as repetitive as that sounds. I think a couple extra forms in between would have went a long way in reducing this repetition, and it would have made finding the Metroids more exciting as you would constantly be discovering new types of battles. And while I wouldn't go as far to call the repetitious fights padding, what I would call padding is the garbage they pull in the second form. Sometimes while fighting the Gamma Metroids, they'll just leave the room in the middle of the fight, requiring the player to essentially go find them again to resume the fight. And if this wasn't bad enough, this happens in about half of the Gamma fights, meaning that a good chunk of the time when these show up, it means you're going to be chasing it down for the next several minutes. There's no beating around the bush, this is just annoying, and it feels like the developers are padding the game length. Besides those things, however, the Metroid fights are still pretty enjoyable, and the increased complexity over the past game's bosses and the improved spectacle make these fights, and really the other fights in the game for that matter, feel all the more exciting. And you know, something that became really noticeable while replaying Samus Returns after the other 2D games is that Samus Returns really seems focused on not just bringing the series back after a long hiatus, but also evolving the series as well. The spectacle element is really played up here. Battle animations feel much more exciting, featuring a dynamic camera with even more dynamic action. Enemies are much crazier this time, genuinely chasing Samus down. Cutscenes feature a much more exciting Samus, constantly looking cool and ready to blast something at a moment's notice. Boss fights are much more played up as well, requiring near constant movement and dodging. I feel like this was done mainly to make this series feel more exciting, more thrilling, like they were trying to bring it into a more action-oriented approach. And that makes sense. The series, for as cool as it is, seems to have trouble attracting the eyes of newcomers. Something about the more understated atmospheric approach of the previous games just had trouble attracting eyes and turning heads. What did turn heads, however, was Metroid Prime, a game that was as action-packed and thrilling as it was atmospheric. It looked exciting enough on the outside to get people's attention, but once it got their attention, it then hooked them with some of the more subtle aspects of the world design. and considering the state of the series right now, where more than ever it needs to turn heads, I don't think that it's all too much of a surprise that the developers tried to replicate the same head-turning spectacle in Samus Returns. And honestly, I'd say it works rather well. All these things, from the much more exciting boss design to the crazy animations, makes the game feel, well, cool. The developers are trying to evolve the series, to take the 2D games and push them in a slightly different direction. One that doesn't lose the satisfying Metroidvania structure, but manages to up the spectacle and add extra focus to the action part of this action-adventure. It also helps that the game isn't just built to get new eyes on it, but also to make sure said newcomers don't lose their way. Very early in the game, Samus gains access to an ability called the Scan Pulse, which when activated reveals a chunk of the map around the player. This is a wonderful tool that can not only help a player out in a pinch without ruining the joy of discovery, but also it's entirely optional as well, meaning that it's not in the way if you don't want to use it either. This, combined with the general structure of Samus Returns, where all the important items are in an area that you're currently exploring, and the fact that there's no need to backtrack, means that the game is super easy for newcomers to get into. It's clear that Mercury Steam did this all to make sure that anyone who wanted to give the series a shot would still be able to enjoy the game, even if they weren't used to the type of game that Metroid usually is. But it should be noted that despite the new action-oriented focus, that doesn't mean that there's not atmosphere at all. While I feel like it's somewhat muted at times, the game still features all these little touches that make for a really cool game world. The backgrounds paint this picture of a society that's long lost. All these mechanical structures and machines are still working in the background, showing a clear indication of just how technologically advanced the previous civilization that lived here was, and yet, the place is slowly decaying and falling apart with no higher life forms to be seen as well. Nature is beginning to reclaim these areas after years and years of neglect, giving the game this very melancholic tone. Unlike the original game, where it often feels like you're genuinely exploring a natural cave system, this game plays things a little differently, allowing for a more tragic game world. Adding to things is the musical pieces, which not only feature some of the greatest tracks and remixes in the entire series, but also contain some of the most desolate sounding music in the entire series as well. I love the contrast between the beginning of the game, where it starts off with the adventurous surface of SR388. Later, the game starts to transition to a much quieter, more somber set of tracks as you begin to discover more and more of this desolate, decaying world. It's a really cool way of presenting the world, and it feels much more akin to the kind of feelings that Metroid Prime's world tries to give off, which is definitely a plus. While I'm on the subject, I should probably mention the game's visual design. With Samus Returns, the 2D series was shifted away from a sprite-based visual style to this new 3D one. I'm honestly a bit mixed on this, because it provides both positives and negatives. On the more negative end, sprites are not only a lot more charming, but they also look a lot cleaner. There are times where the visual design of Samus Returns can look a little bit muted, and other times where the environments can look way too simplistic. It never quite looks as polished as previous games, and being that it's on the 3DS, the low resolution screen definitely makes some areas look a little gross. On the other end though, backgrounds are allowed to have a much richer level of detail. You can see all these little things in the background, things like streams and little creatures hopping about, distant decaying structures, things that would be much harder to accomplish with a sprite-based design. What would have been just as hard to accomplish with sprites as well is the more dynamic animations I mentioned earlier. Things like the camera swerving in around Samus as she pulls off some cool move would be almost impossible to do as effectively with sprites. Overall, while I do prefer the look of the sprites better, it's mostly because of the 3DS's low resolution screen, which often muddies up things more than it would if, say, the game had been made for an HD console. So while I think the visual design isn't perfect, I'm okay with how Samus Returns looks, and I'm alright with this style if they decide to keep it going forward. It provides enough positives to be a worthwhile change, especially if we get a game in this style on the Switch, where a lot of these simplistic areas and muddy design elements won't be a problem, and where it will still have the benefits of this visual style as well. And you know, I've been mentioning that dynamic element of the visual design, but I haven't even mentioned the areas where it's most prominent. While the original Metroid 2 barely had any bosses outside of the Metroid fights themselves, Samus Returns ups the ante by adding in several new bosses, each of which are ridiculously cool. First, let's start with the Diggernaut. The build-up to this fight is super cool. Early in the game, Samus encounters this thing, and occasionally you'll just see it roaming around, almost following Samus. At one point, the thing begins chasing Samus, and since Samus at the time wasn't upgraded enough to stand a chance against this monstrosity, your only choice is to run and hide from it. This section is super cool to go through, with the only problem being due to the 3DS's lack of buttons. Several inputs are mapped to the touchscreen or weird button combinations, which normally on its own can be a bit annoying since it feels like you're constantly having to move your hands all over the system. In this section, it's a bit more annoying though since you have to do this all under a time limit. It's certainly not ideal, but regardless it's a fun section, and really goes away in establishing just how dangerous the Diggernaut is. So when later in the game it shows up and you're forced to fight it, the fight feels super tense. The Diggernaut has all these different attack types, and the fight is super exciting. You're constantly dodging this attack, jumping over this, shooting that, and it ends up using several of Samus's abilities, namely the Spider Ball, in some pretty genius ways. And when you finally take the thing down after a tough battle and Samus shoots the thing after looking at it, it feels so cool. After the Diggernaut, you only have a few Metroids left, almost all of them being the final form of the Metroids, the Omega Metroids, which are also a blast to fight actually. Something cool about these last areas is that they managed to keep the same cool environmental storytelling elements of the original Metroid 2 without causing the actual gameplay to suffer like in that game. In Metroid 2, the areas were barren of life, owing to the Metroids essentially making those areas uninhabitable. This was impressive from an environmental storytelling perspective, as it showcased just how deadly of a species the Metroids were. However, these areas weren't so impressive from a gameplay perspective, as the lack of enemies and barren design made them quite a slog to get through. Samus Returns remedies this by changing the types of enemies that appear. Enemies in this area are either ridiculously strong and durable, which they would need to be to deal with the Metroids, machine-based, meaning that the Metroids wouldn't attack them, or are the types of enemies that explode, ensuring that the Metroids would stay away given that they wouldn't get anything out of fighting those enemies. It still showcases just how much of a threat the Metroids are, and considering these are the only types of creatures that can survive down here, it implies that the Metroids have probably wiped everything else out. And it still accomplishes this while still giving you enemies to fight and keeping the areas from feeling desolate. But eventually you'll manage to get rid of all the Metroids except one, the Queen Metroid, who's waiting for you just ahead. And when you finally manage to reach her, the fight feels way cooler than anything the original could hope to do. Just like the Diggernaut, the Queen Metroid has a super dynamic fight with tons of different attacks to dodge and a lot of these cooler spectacle-focused moments. And the fight is hard too, requiring some pretty solid timing and some serious focus to try and keep away from the Queen Metroid's attacks. But soon enough you'll take her down, and that would seem to be it for the Metroid population. That is until Samus finds a baby Metroid. At first she intends to kill it, but the baby Metroid doesn't see Samus as a threat, but instead as her mother. Samus takes a liking to the baby Metroid and decides to keep it alive, and in turn it decides to follow Samus around. It even eats away at these normally unbreakable crystals, actually allowing Samus to escape the underground caverns. But if you thought this is where it ended, you'd be wrong. Once arriving at her ship, all seems well until out of nowhere Ridley shows up, attempting to steal the last living Metroid. This results in one final fight, where the two face off not only in the best fight in the entire game, but also the coolest Ridley fight in the entire series as well. Ridley is a much bigger threat here, able to take Samus out very quickly if the player isn't at the top of their game. He has a ton of dangerous attacks, all of which require ridiculously good timing to even have any hope of dodging. He's also ruthless, throwing one attack after another, meaning the player is constantly on their toes, dodging left and right in the hopes of just surviving. This fight even has these cool animations where you see Samus and Ridley doing all these cool attacks between phases, and it's just so freaking cool. The whole fight is just cool. I've heard some criticize this fight as being needless fan service that came out of nowhere. On one hand, I really wouldn't say it came out of nowhere. Literally, at the start of the next game, Ridley would massacre an entire space station to try and get that same baby Metroid, so why wouldn't he do it here? It's also certainly not needless. Not only does it give much more of an explanation as to why Ridley would even know Samus had the baby Metroid to begin with, but it also shows even more why the baby Metroid was so important to Samus in Super Metroid. The thing actively saves her in the fight, trying to help what it assumes is its mother. This gives much more weight to later events in the series, as now there's even more evidence as to why Samus cares so much about the darn thing. And on the fan service element, well, of course it's fan service. I want to remind you that this game came after a long period of problems for the Metroid fanbase, where every turn felt like another attack. This whole game was fan service, so what's wrong with giving a little more fan service? Regardless of that, it's a ridiculously fun fight, and it serves as a wonderful final boss to Samus Returns. After Ridley is defeated, Samus and the baby Metroid leave SR388, ending the events of Metroid Samus Returns. It's a solid ending with a fun-as-heck final boss that caps up what is, in my eyes, an absolute blast of a game. And that just about wraps it up on the 2D Metroid series retrospective. Where the series goes next, no one really knows for now. While Samus Returns certainly did well critically speaking, there's really no telling if it sold well enough to even get a follow-up. Sure, we still have Metroid Prime 4 coming up at some point, but with the series' stagnating growth and what seem to be rather mediocre sales for Samus Returns, there's really no telling where the series goes from here. Regardless, here's hoping that we don't have to wait too long for Samus to make another appearance. After getting to experience the pure magic of these games again, I feel like I've gotten a much better understanding of just how brilliant this series is, so I sincerely hope this isn't the last 2D adventure I get to go on with Samus. But for now, I guess I'll see you next time. But wait, what am I doing next time? I mean, the Metroid series Game Over analysis is finished. What am I planning next? Well, I've been planning something for a long time. This Metroid series was essentially a test to see if I could make these kinds of videos, and now that I've gotten my bearings, I think it's time to cover the series I've been wanting to cover since I started this channel. Although, I say series, but that's not completely correct. Next time on Game Over Analysis, we'll be delving into 3 different series that are deeply linked, as we follow them from simple beginnings all the way until the series end up going into the ground. Join me next time as I cover every single one of the Mario RPGs. Until next time, I guess that's Game Over Analysis. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed.